This presentation is Animal Tracks and Sign, the Secret Language of Nature. My name is Jonah Evans. When most people go on a walk outdoors, they see beautiful landscapes, beautiful scenery. They might hear some birds, might see some deer off in the distance. But largely, nature is a fairly quiet place, and it might even seem somewhat devoid of life beyond, plants and brush and the like. However, to a trained tracker and someone who knows to slow down and look closer, there are signs of life absolutely everywhere. In the upper left, we have sparrows in a typical feeding sign behavior. In the lower left, that's porcupine feeding sign. Upper right is the sign of a acorn woodpecker, and the lower right is a spotted skunk. And here we have coyote in the upper left, moose feeding sign on aspen in the lower left. In the upper right, there's raccoon and eastern chipmunk and jumping mouse and a paramyscus, a small mouse, all in the same photo. And in the lower right, we have a bobcat with tracks and scat. So why learn to track? Well, it's fairly simple. Animals are camouflaged, nocturnal, and shy. At least many of them are, and can be very difficult to detect. Tracks, on the other hand, aren't. And in many places where there is good substrate, they can be extremely easy to find, and animals don't know how to hide their tracks. So when many people think of tracks and sign, they immediately think of footprints. But beyond footprints, what we consider in the body of animal tracks and sign is also things like scats, like this coyote scat here, urine. This is a classic cottontail urine mark left in the desert in arid regions. You find these all over the place. Those are the little pellets also left by the cottontail. Feeding signs, such as this feral hog rooting. Pellets. And most people have heard of owl pellets before, but did you know that many other birds also create cough pellets? So ravens, crows, many shorebirds, these are sanderling pellets from the beach in California. Also trails and runs. And shelters and nests and burrows. And also skulls and bones. In wildlife research, animal tracks have been used a lot for a variety of different projects. However, animal track surveys depend on two categories of two characteristics, I guess. Suitable field conditions and skilled observers. So if you don't have good substrate, you're not going to find good tracks. And if you don't have good skilled observers, you're likely going to have misidentified tracks. So researchers have worked on a variety of methods to control for variable substrates, such as creating scent stations and track plates and things that attract an animal to a spot where the substrate has been controlled. So maybe they'll bring in some sand to an area, or they'll rake out an area, or even do road drags where they drag tires behind a road. And the photo down below, it's a raccoon that stepped on a not normal piece of substrate that allowed us to see the track. That's a cow patty, and it was likely a fairly unfortunate experience for that raccoon. The next problem is observer error, and it can be surprisingly high in animal track identification. To get around this, there's a certification system that was developed in South Africa, and it's set at a very high bar, so some of the best trackers in the world are certified in this and are instructors in this system. And through this system, you are awarded a different level based on how well you performed. And this is a great way to be able to accurately categorize a person's skill level. So for the use in animal track related research, you can hire somebody who has a known ability to identify tracks at a certain level of accuracy. So on to identifying tracks. Just like when you're a kid and you are learning the alphabet, you start with simple capital letters and work your way through. And when you think of learning the alphabet now, it's hard to imagine that some letters might be harder than other letters. But when you're a kid, you get many of them mixed up. You might put some of them backwards from other ones, so a P might seem like a lowercase b, there's things that were really confusing to you as a child. But once you learn these letters and you start seeing different variations of them, our mind has the ability, through really complicated and refined pattern recognition, to be able to identify strange, obscure variations of these letters. So here we have sort of a graffiti representation of the alphabet, and you can see that your mind is still able to identify many of those letters, even though they are dramatically changed from the letters we were originally taught. And that's very much the same with animal tracks. We start with clear, easy tracks, and eventually you start pushing yourself into obscure, very difficult, very distorted tracks. And as with other wildlife, the way you start is with clear tracks and learning what the field marks are. So field marks are defined as identifying features that you focus on to help you identify a bird or a mammal or a track. And so one of the first things trackers look for is the number and shape of toes. In this track here, there are 5 toes visible. What about the presence and the shape of claws? So in this case, there are 5 claws, and they are quite long. They're very far away from the toes, and that tells you something about the behavior of this animal. Most animals with big, long claws use those claws for digging. One exception is the porcupine, who uses them primarily for climbing. We also look at symmetry. So if I was to divide the track right down the middle, and I usually try to draw that line right through the middle of the palm pad, can I fold it in half and close it up like a perfect book? And in this case, no, you can't. The left side is off center from the right side. And what about the shape of the palm pad? Is it a big flat pad, or is it made up of separate small lobes? And how big is it in proportion to the overall track? Those are all characteristics to look at in the palm pad. And then lastly, the heel pad. Is there a heel pad? A heel pad is separate from the palm pad further back, and so keep your eyes out for the presence of a heel pad. One thing to keep in mind about the size of the track is different field guides use different measurement techniques. Some of them include the claw lengths, and some of them do not. My personal preference is to not include claw lengths in measurements, and in the app that I produced, it does not have claw lengths in there. And the reason for that is many tracks will register without showing claws. And so you want to be able to take a useful measurement off the largest number of tracks out there. And so some field guides include claws, some don't. Just look at the beginning of the book and figure out which is which before you move forward. So in review, we have claws, toe pads, palm pads, and heel pad on a classic mammal foot. I'm using the sort of generalized language here. There are more scientific terms, such as carpal or tarsal pads for the toes, metacarpal and metatarsal pads for the palm pad, and proximal pad for the heel. So one of the next things we're going to do in this presentation is begin building up a library of search images in your mind, essentially learning our ABCs, so that when you are in the field and you find a partial track, you can then have some reference in your mind. So you have a bunch of different tracks to pull from that can help you identify that partial track. An example of using a search image can be seen right here. So here we have a couple of little lines on a map, and I want you to take a minute and look at them and tell me what you think those lines are. What if I add a few more? Is anything popping out to you? How about a few more? And by now you should recognize that this is the shape of Texas. And it's pretty amazing how some folks, especially, every now and then they'll just pop out right away from the very first step in that animation or in the second one. just from a few squiggles on a map or on the screen, you're able to immediately recognize the shape of Texas. This is a really amazing ability of our minds to be able to do that. Now let's try one more exercise here. Let me add a few more lines here. And just note when you recognize the shape. This is Kyrgyzstan, and likely nobody recognized it. And the reason for this is simple. If you lived there, you probably would have recognized it right away. But because you do not have a search image for this country in your mind, of course you're unable to identify it. And so once we build up some search images for some tracks, hopefully when you start seeing portions of tracks or different variations of tracks in the field, you will then be able to identify more easily. So one of the ways it feels like to me is when I find a partial track, it's almost like my mind is going through a Rolodex of other tracks, flipping through a flip guide, so to speak, and then finally I find one that fits. Ultimately, it's this variability in tracks that really makes tracking a challenge and also very fun. These are all photos of raccoon tracks. Sometimes they'll show 4 toes. Sometimes they'll show 5. Sometimes the animal might slide into the mud, and sometimes it might be on firm substrate or deep substrate. There's things that can result in a lot of variation. If you were to go out and identify birds in Texas, the place to start is with the common, easy birds that live here year-round. If you tried immediately to start identifying all birds, there's over 400 species that can be found in the state. I think well over 400 species. And then there's the males and the females and the juveniles and the different plumages, breeding plumage or non-breeding. And, it can get incredibly complex. With mammals, if you're looking at mammal tracks, there's far fewer different mammals out there. So that makes it a lot easier. If you can learn the tracks of 20 or 30 species, you're doing fantastic. The challenge comes with the variability. So we're going to start with a few track ID shortcuts. One of the things you can do is just immediately group animals by the number of toes. So if you see a track and the animal has 4 toes in the front and 4 toes in the hind, so you're looking at these tracks and all the tracks you find are showing 4 toes, then you're likely looking at dogs, cats, or rabbits. And by dogs and cats, I mean anything in the canine or feline family. If it has 5 toes, you're looking at raccoons, weasels, skunks, and if it's super tiny, a shrew. And if you're seeing some tracks with 4 toes and some with 5, those ones with 4 are likely the front tracks, and the ones with 5 are likely the hinds, and those are most likely squirrels, mice, and other rodents. And then if there's 2 or fewer toes, you're looking at deer, hogs, sheep. By fewer, I would mean if there's 1 toe, you'd be looking at horses or donkeys or zebras. So let's dig into the ones with 4 toes. Dogs have 4 toes on the front and 4 on the hind, with the claws showing, and the track is pretty symmetrical. We also have cats in this category, and rabbits. One of the most common questions that I get about animal tracks is this a mountain lion track or a dog track? And it turns out to be one of the more challenging aspects of animal track identification. So starting with dogs, as I just mentioned, we have 4 toes. The claws usually show, but not always. The tracks are usually quite symmetrical, and sometimes you can even draw an X shape through the negative space between the toes. Also, the heel pad is triangular in shape. So here's another big dog track. It's mostly symmetrical. Especially in the big dog tracks, it'll be more difficult to draw an X through. You can see the little red marks where my X cut through a toe, but you can kind of see the X there. And the heel pad is triangular. And now the most important thing when it comes to identifying canine from feline tracks, I would say is the relative size of the heel pad in comparison to the toes. So if you imagine the toes and imagine moving them into the heel pad. In a canine track, you can usually only fit about 3 of those toes into the track. Here's just another example of a dog track. It's splayed out in the mud. Notice the triangular shaped heel pad, the 4 toes, the claws. Perfect dog track. Now in contrast, we have the cat family. Cats also have 4 toes, and the claws rarely show. The track, you can't draw an X through it, and it's also quite asymmetrical. That negative space between the toes is more of a C shape versus an X shape. Let me go back here. The other thing is that there is a double lobe at the anterior end of the palm pad. So at the top of the pad is very wide and flat, and then the pad is proportionally much larger in comparison to the rest of the whole track than in a dog. And so I'll show you an example of that here. So it's asymmetrical. By the way, its asymmetry is not random. It's asymmetrical in the same way as our hand. So if you hold your hand up to the screen right now and imagine that your thumb does not register, so your thumb is out of the picture, which of your fingers is the longest? And you can use that to identify whether this is a right foot or a left foot. Your middle finger is going to be the longest toe. And in this case, this is a right foot because it shows you that toe 3, I guess it is. So I'll use my mouse here and see if that shows up. But this toe here is the longest one, and so that is a right foot. And then the heel pad or the palm pad rather, is large and trapezoidal in shape. And if we imagine those toes, you can immediately tell you can fit all 4 toes into the pad. Now, as with any rule in tracking, there are exceptions, and it's not always going to work perfectly. But by and large, this is a very useful thing to look at. The other thing is the trail pattern. Mountain lions very commonly use this overstep walk gait. So this is a left front below and then the left hind above. And everywhere you go, you find them doing this. So here on the from right to left, you have a left front, left hind, and then a right front, right hind as it walks from the right to the left. These same characteristics are also visible in other felines. So this is a bobcat track. The right front is on the left and the right hind is on the right. Notice that letter M shape or that double lobe at the top of the heel pad. And also the leading toes. So that tell you that this is a right foot. So to test our knowledge now, we have this mystery track. And the question is, what are we seeing here? First of all, the track is actually quite symmetrical, but you have to eliminate the parts where it slid into the track here. So if you see those parts where it slid in and you eliminate that, you start being able to see the actual footprint. It's actually quite symmetrical. You can't quite draw an X through it, but the palm pad is triangular. And if I try to fit those toes into the actual heel pad, you can't fit the 4th one. So to recap that, the felines have a very large palm pad with a double lobe, the track is asymmetrical, and the claws rarely show. The canines have a small palm pad with a large lobe, the track is symmetrical, and the claws usually show. And then most importantly, the size of that palm pad. Just look at the difference in these pictures here. The felines on the left have this huge palm pad, the canines on the right have a very small palm pad in comparison. So moving on to animals with 5 toes, that brings us to bears, raccoons, weasels, and skunks, and also shrews. So first of all, for the folks that are in Texas, I wanted just to show that there are actually quite a few bear reports that we get in Texas. So Class 1 bear reports from 2001 to 2016. You can see there's a lot of activity out in West Texas. Bear tracks are really hard to misidentify for anything. There's just nothing that big, except for a human, which sometimes can leave a similar track. Keep an eye out for those claw marks. This is a fairly small black bear track from Big Bend region. We also have raccoons. So those little tracks that look like tiny little hands from little kids. 5 toes. The claws occasionally show. They're extremely common and highly variable. The other animal in that same family would be the ringtail that occasionally occurs in Texas, or occurs quite a bit in Texas. We occasionally find its claws. There is another one in the same family that does very rarely occur in Texas. That's the coatimundi. It's a larger version of a raccoon with a straight, long tail that holds up above its body as it walks around. One thing is that these tracks are very easily mistaken with a bobcat. I know it doesn't look like that from these pictures here, but they really can be when they're in different substrate and they're not showing these long, skinny fingers. Here's a beautiful photo of a ringtail track, a little blurry, but it has 5 toes on the front and 5 on the hind. Sometimes that 5th toe, or many times, it does not show up in the hind track, and the tracks are usually only about 1 inch long. So if mistaken with anything, they're often mistaken with little house cat tracks. Moving on to weasels, I find long-tail weasel tracks from time to time, or other weasel tracks. The small weasels, their tracks are often a pretty big mess, like in the photo here. They do a little bounding pattern where the hind feet land right on top of the front tracks, and it can leave a pretty big mess. I mean, here we have the full bound pattern with the right front, left front, and then the 2 hinds that landed side by side on top of those tracks. But again, 5 toes on the front and hind. The claws occasionally show. Tracks are very asymmetrical, and the heel pad, or the palm pad, is very lobed. You see these small, separate little lobes. They almost look like separate little toes making up the palm pad. Other animals we have in the weasel family would include river otters. And if you look closely here, you can see the webbing between the toes. And again, we're going to kind of go through a number of tracks sort of fast here. And the idea is to give you a quick and dirty introduction to the alphabet, so to speak. So don't feel like you need to remember everything I'm talking about here. The idea is to show you a bunch of tracks and then point you in the direction of some good resources to learn more. And now that you've had this introduction, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to dig into the field guides. Another weasel we have in Texas is the badger. It's a large animal in the weasel family, big blunt claws that it used for digging. Then we have other animals with 5 toes on the fronts and hinds. It would be skunks. In Texas, we have 5 species: the striped skunk, the eastern spotted skunk and western spotted skunk, the hognose skunk, and the hooded skunk. Although we can really only tell if it's a spotted skunk, a striped skunk, or a hognose. So all of those, or I guess not all, well, I guess all of those skunks have 5 toes on the front and 5 in the back. The striped skunk and the hognose skunk have big claws on the front track used for digging. These are photos of a striped skunk track. They're the most common skunk we find all over the state. And then one of the last groups here is the rodent family. 4 toes in the front and 5 in the back. Claws usually show, but they're very small and often used for climbing. And these are all different drawings of little rodent tracks. So some of the rodents that we have in Texas, at least, are very, very tiny. So this is a trail or a track pattern of a pocket mouse, and you can see how tiny these are next to a penny. And to many people's surprise, when they first start getting into tracking, you can accurately identify to the family or to the genus many tiny little mice species and shrews and voles, things that you would not have initially thought that you could identify with animal tracks. And it's one of the more advanced skills, but it's also pretty exciting when you get into tracking to try to dig into those more obscure things you might find. This is a classic, perfect pattern of a gray squirrel. So in Texas, there are eastern gray squirrels and fox squirrels, and they look about the same. And so here's a perfect pattern. The hind feet are above, the 4 toes on the front feet are visible, and the front tracks down below. And here is a very cool track, really unusual one. The pad is almost all you see, which is this funny pebbly texture. And here we have a hind track landing partially on top of a front track. So it's 2 tracks, and the front track is on the right side, and you can see the claw marks way up ahead, the 4 toes on the claw marks. This is the track of a porcupine. And porcupine tracks, you never see the toes. You only see this big, weird palm pad that looks like a basketball texture, and then the claws. The toes are held up off the ground when it's walking. And then lastly, in the rodents, we have this dinosaur, turkey-like looking thing, and this is actually the track of a beaver. It's about 6 or 7 inches long right here. And if you look closely between the 2 giant long toes, you can see webbing connecting the toes. That's the hind foot. And on the right side, we're seeing the 2 middle toes of the front track, which partially gets stepped on by the hind track. So moving on to ungulates or hoofed animals, we have deer, feral hog, sheep, and peccary or javelina. And the most common question that I get is this a feral hog or a deer track? And there's a few really helpful characteristics that can help us in identifying which of those it is. So first of all, if there's 2 toes on the front, and actually that 4 in parentheses means that there's the 2 dew claws that sometimes show up behind, and you can see those in the picture on the right. Deer actually have those as well, but on feral hogs, those dew claws are extremely wide. In fact, they're so wide that you can bring the track directly between the dew claws. So notice the animation there on the left. I'll do that one more time. So here's the track with the dew claws, and you can slide that track right between the dew claws, and you'll notice that there's plenty of room for the track to fit there. On deer, the dew claws are directly behind the track itself. Also, feral hogs, the tips of the track are really blunt or flattened, and the inner wall of the track has a somewhat concave shape. They can sometimes be confused with calf tracks, like a small or immature cow, and also with deer tracks in some cases. So here on the left, we have a feral hog track. I guess it's 2 tracks. So the front is on the left, and then the hind foot partially registered on top. And then we have the deer track on the right. Deer tracks are going in the direction of the point, so they're pointing in the direction they're going. And on feral hog tracks, that point you'll see is much more rounded, and it's also splayed in the front part of the track, and it usually comes together in the back. Here's another feral hog track on the left, deer track on the right. Rounded point tips on the feral hog, very pointed on the deer. And one more, deer going down to the left on the left side of the image, and a feral hog double register. So both of these hind feet are landing on top, making things a little bit weird to look at. The feral hog is going up and to the left, and very rounded points. So hopefully that will be helpful for folks getting into trying to tell feral hog from deer. And and just keep an eye out for those dew claws. If you don't see them in the first track, go a few tracks down the road, and hopefully you'll find one that shows those dew claws. It's much more common to see the dew claws in feral hogs than it is in deer. So next, we have bird tracks. And, when a lot of people think of animal tracks, they just think of mammals. But actually, bird tracking is actually surprisingly fun and easier than you'd imagine, just because the morphology of their feet is a lot simpler. And so if you get yourself a copy of Mark Elbrock's Bird Tracks and Sign book, you'll notice that bird tracks are categorized into 5 different groups. So one is classic, and classic tracks just are 3 toes in the front and 1 long toe in the back. Then you have game bird tracks with 3 toes in the front and either no toe at all showing in the back or just a little tiny dot showing up. Then there's zygodactyl. So zygodactyl is 2 toes in the front and 2 in the back. So that would be like an owl or a roadrunner. In fact, let me go back here and just say in classic tracks, that can be things like herons or egrets or many of the perching birds. So anything as tiny as a warbler, as big as a hawk. Those are all the perching bird or classic bird tracks. And then the game birds are things like turkeys and quail, the animals that spend a lot of time on the ground. So then we had zygodactyl, roadrunners, owls, woodpeckers. And then we have palmate tracks. So this is basically a webbed track. Anything like a duck, a goose, a gull, not a cormorant. That's the next category, but a tern. So most of the swimming birds have palmate tracks, and then lastly, we have our cormorants and our pelicans in what we call toe-to-palmate, or all four toes are webbed together. Once you know those 5 categories, classic, game bird, zygodactyl, palmate, and toe-to-palmate, if you have a copy of the mammal or of the bird tracks and sign book, you simply flip to the front cover or the back cover, and you'll see the category for the bird track. And so if it's a classic bird track, you flip to the front cover, find classic bird tracks, and there's a list of all the birds by length, and it shows the measurement range for each bird. You scroll, move down to the one that shows your the length of the track you're trying to identify, and you flip to those pages, and you just have a few pages to go through, and it's usually quite fast to identify the track. And it's a fun way to get into a whole different area of animal tracks that you might not have thought of. And, while we're on the topic, we might as well look at herps as well. Herps just means reptiles and amphibians. And so things like turtles, we find their tracks all over the place. I'm not very great at identifying different types of turtles, but at least being aware of a turtle trail is a great thing to be aware of. They're super obvious. They look almost like little tank treads moving through the deep mud. Then we also have alligators in that category. They can look a little bit like beaver tracks from time to time. Notice the scales visible on this track. It's a big old alligator track, 6 inches long, and they actually get quite a bit bigger than that. Frog tracks, toads. Toads often walk, whereas frogs often hop. There are plenty of exceptions to that rule, but it's just a sort of a idea to get you thinking about what you're looking at. Also, there's lizard trails and snake trails. So snakes leave these slithery marks all over the place. We'll find them in dusty roads. In this case, it's in a muddy puddle as the snake was, trying to get some traction to get out of there. And this is the snake track. This is the track of a sidewinder from the Mojave. And then lastly, we have invertebrates. And so that includes things like beetles, and we find their trails all over the place. Scorpions, and with scorpion tracks, you look for groups of 4 on each side. So remember, scorpions are an arachnid, and that means they have 8 legs. And so on each side, if you look really closely, you'll see 4 little dots. Sometimes it can be hard to see, and you have to follow it out for a little while to find 4 little, groups of little 4 feet on each side. But when you find those, you're looking at a scorpion or a spider, potentially. Although spider tracks tend to be very wispy and leave these little lines behind them. I also find things like caterpillar tracks quite commonly. Earthworm trails are also common. And one of my favorites is mud dauber digging sign. So we'll find this in mud puddles all around the country. And you look for these little scratches, and oftentimes you'll see mud daubers flying in and digging around looking for a good spot of the perfect mud to carry back to build its little burrow. Crayfish are another great one. One thing that's cool about crayfish is that they have little tiny pinchers on the end of each foot. And so here's this part of a crayfish down below, and up above you can see a crayfish trail. And notice that there's those little pairs of dots. Each of those little pairs of dots is one of those feet, the little pincher tips of one of those feet walking along, leaving marks there. So animal tracking is ultimately reading stories in the earth, and learning a new language takes time. And today we've just learned a few letters. The next step is to begin learning a few words and then a few sentences. And then you begin building the tools to be able to read full stories in the ground. And ultimately, tracking opens up a window into an entirely different world that is often unseen and all around us. One thing that some folks might take away from an introductory presentation like this is, wow, that's a lot of information. There's so many details to remember. And ultimately, the most important thing is to enjoy being out there. And there is some incredible aesthetic beauty in animal tracks and in the ability to take time and solve these puzzles that is really enjoyable. And so some of the hard details and memorization and all that stuff aside, just appreciating the beauty of a perfect track here. Even though this is an invasive species, this is a bullfrog, this track was just so beautiful and perfect. Here's another trail that I just loved. At first, I didn't even notice it, but if you look closely, you'll see that there's a pattern emerging in these cracks. And right at the bottom of the screen, you'll see what looks sort of like a peace sign, right? So two lines that come down, and then one on either side pointing down, and then up above it, you'll see another similar mark, and above that. And if you keep following it, you'll see that repeated pattern throughout. When I took a closer look, I realized that this was the trail of a heron that had walked along the muddy beach. And then as the mud dried, it all cracked, and each toe became a crack in the mud. And solving those little puzzles like that is just a really fun way to appreciate nature that folks might not be aware of. So here's another example. The tracks down below are of a turkey vulture, and that imprint above is the mark of a fish. And that turkey vulture came in there after a big flood. When fish had been washed up in the muddy bank, it found that fish and it grabbed it and took it off somewhere to eat it. These are the tracks of a northern harrier, a hawk. Beautiful tracks of a hawk, and there's also the trail of a skunk in there if you look really close. And then lastly, this is the trail of a Mexican free-tailed bat from under a bridge in California. There's actually two bats there, and it's sort of a chaotic-looking trail as these bats plodded through the sand trying to find somewhere safe to spend time. And I actually was able to follow it across the bridge and found the bats roosting on the side of the bridge. So if you're interested in learning more, I want to recommend a number of different resources. Animal Tracks and Scat of California is one of the only guides that includes mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. That is, and is a very well-rounded guide for the whole. And it can be of use anywhere in the country. If you're in Texas, there's only a few species it does not include, such as armadillo. But by and large, many of the species that we have are there. So that's a useful book to consider getting. There's also Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest by Dave Moskowitz. It's another regional guide, very high-quality guide that has lots of tracks and sign in it. Mammal Tracks and Sign by Mark Elbrock in the second edition, which is now out with contributions from Casey McFarland, is essentially the Bible of mammal tracking. It's a huge book and an incredible contribution. Has all kinds of information about animal behaviors, feeding signs, and the like. And it's just a wonderful book. If you're just really wanting to dig deep, that's an absolute necessity to get that book. And the same could be said for Bird Tracks and Sign, also by Mark Elbrock. There's several other books on the right that are good as well. The newest edition of the Peterson Field Guide that was revised by Mark Elbrock is also great. Then there's the Bird Feather Guide by Dave Scott and Casey McFarland. Animal Skulls by Mark Elbrock is another great one. And then Tracks and Sign of Insects. Lastly, there is a field guide that I created that's for the iPhone and Android called iTrack Wildlife. And it's only for mammals. It has, I believe, 71 different mammals in there, 500 or 600, 700 photos, lots of photos of tracks. And it's another guide that you can take anywhere you want with you. I also have a website that is naturetracking.com, and tons of free content on there. Lots of photos. So if you want to just try to look up a track or read about what we're doing in the tracking world, that's a great place to go. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be interested in animal tracks. I hope that this inspires you to get out there and start looking at the dirt a little bit. And if you are interested in more, please go to my website. There's ways to contact me on there. And with that, we will wrap up this presentation, and thank you all for joining.